Welcome, everyone. We'll get started shortly, but I'd like to give people a few more moments to get their audio preferences settled before we begin. All right. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Black Resistance Within Higher Education. Before I hand it off to our presenters, I would like to cover a few technical details just in case you haven't joined an ACRO webinar in the past. We use Zoom webinar, which is similar to Zoom meeting, except that your cameras and your microphones are disabled by default. To interact with the presenters, you have two main options. To interact with the presenters, you can chat via chat button. This defaults to the hosts and panelists, so meaning only they can see your message. However, if you want everyone to see it, make sure to select everyone on the drop-down menu. If you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and use the Q&A button. You can ask questions anonymously, and you can view existing comments as well, or questions. And if you do have a questions and you would like to speak rather than writing, there is a hand button in the reactions tab. So go ahead and click the little raised hand button, and then we will allow you to speak. So if you have any questions, please do write those. So anyway, without any further ado, I will hand it off to Portia, our moderator.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for spending some time with us. This is the ACRO Black Caucus webinar talking about Black resistance in higher education. I'll go a little bit further into some details of how we came up with that, but first, let's hear from our incoming Black Caucus President, Dr. Wendolyn Davis.
Thank you, Portia. Hello, everybody. Just a quick welcome. Thank you so much for everyone who is joining us, and thank you for the panelists who we are looking forward to hearing from and absorbing information from. And yes, I'm sorry, Wendolyn. I am Wendolyn Davis, the director of the Transfer Center at University of Tennessee. I'm also the chair-elect for Black Caucus, ACRO Black Caucus. So thank you once again. Just remember, if you need to throw something in the chat or raise your hand if you have a question, we look forward to this being a conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. So we decided what would be our February webinar, because this is Black History Month, but we're learning all year. And I did not know this, and I don't know if anyone else knows this. You can deduct points from me if you did, that's fine. But I did not realize that every year there is a theme for Black history. And Black history's theme this year for the Black History Month, this year's theme was Black resistance, highlighting people who showed resistance against oppression, against people of color, African Americans throughout history. And we thought, how could we narrow that down? And we did that with trying to focus on higher education and in our fields. And we've had some wonderful people who have decided to discuss this. We have with us, actually, I'll let them do the introductions. Whitney, please go ahead and introduce yourself and where you're from. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. I'm Whitney West, and I am the law registrar at LSU Law.
Great. Dr. Tina DeNeen.
Thanks, Portia. I'm Tina DeNeen. I currently work at ACRO as Associate Executive Director for Education and Member Development. And my background is as a university registrar for most of my career. I've worked at 5 different institutions, 4 of those as registrar. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. And our wonderful past president, Adrienne McDay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adrienne McDay. I was the coordinator of registration at William Rainey Harper College until 2015. I also served as president of the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. So thank you for this opportunity today.
Great. All right, ladies, let's just get started. Let's get right into it. Whitney, can you let me know this question is for all, but I want to know Black resistance. What does it mean to you? And how have you applied it within your career in higher education?
Okay, so as a Black woman who is disabled, I have a lot of minoritized identities. So when I got my chronic illness and became disabled, it was kind of like you have a lot of stuff stacked up against you. And as Black women, a lot of times, because of those two minoritized identities, we tend to kind of feel like we're in the middle of an intersection where we're unprotected, and anything can come at us from any angle. Especially even in higher education in the world legally, we're not covered. Most states don't have combined statutes where you can even sue your employer or whomever for discrimination as a Black woman, because the identities intersect. You'd have to prove it as a Black person, or you have to prove it as a woman. And if there's a Black man who has gotten what you're saying you haven't gotten, you can't do it. If there's a white woman who's gotten it, you can't do it. So I wanted to start researching the importance of having cross-section, intersectional statutes and how this has affected Black women in higher education. So currently I'm a doctoral student and my research is at the intersection of gender, race, and disability. And I'm studying how the combination of identities has affected Black women in higher education. And some of the things I've kind of learned through that is that we can use our identities to fight back. And a lot of times, most of us have these tertiary identities. Like sometimes we feel like we can't fight as a Black person because of all the stigma. Sometimes we feel like we can't fight as a woman because of all the stigma. But what I found was that under the ADA, I got some power back. I was able to easily prove when people were discriminating against me due to my disability. There were times where I kind of had felt lost before, like, is this, are they saying this because I'm overweight? Are they saying this because I'm Black? Are they saying this because they think I don't have money? Are they saying this because I'm disabled? This was when someone at my previous job made a comment like, oh, you have a Peloton? And I was like, well, where is this coming from? Like, what are they saying? Because it could come from any of those angles. And that a lot of times makes us uncomfortable because, like, what do we say? How do we prove it? And I realized that under the ADA, I'm covered. So when I went to my next institution, I made sure that I filed everything I needed to file with the ADA office so that I could get not only the accommodations that I needed, but it was registered, that I have a disability. And I know a lot of people get scared to do that, but it's one of the ways that we can bring our power back, because once we start talking about that tertiary identity, you can bring in being Black, you can bring in being a woman, because also in my research, I'm talking to ADA coordinators and I'm saying, how do you speak to intersectional communities? Have you considered that maybe a Black woman is not going to be comfortable coming to talk to you because of all the trauma that she's received based on her other identities? How are you making sure people are comfortable? So I'm able to bring back in those identities in the conversation with my tertiary identity, because a lot of times we don't feel protected. 60% of people in the United States have a chronic illness, which can be considered disability. That can be migraines, it can be diabetes, it can be high blood pressure, cancer. It doesn't have to be what people consider major illnesses. And also the other thing about disability, nobody gets through life without being disabled, even at least temporarily. You might be disabled for old age, you may break your foot, you may break your arm, you may, have COVID. So this is something that should be of interest to us as Black people, because a lot of times Black people are the ones who are the most disabled. And even if you look at the statues of like who was murdered by police, it's a lot of times disabled people, and then this disproportionately Black people in that case. So we can't have DEI work if you don't consider the disabled. And for me, how that's impacted higher education at the SIM conference in Canada this year, I presented about the absence of disability and accessibility within ACRO's DEI model. And even thinking about that space that we were in there, it was difficult for me to get to sessions because of the distance of how you have to walk. I encountered stairs where I didn't know there would be stairs, and things like that people aren't considering, or that the accessible pathway was on the opposite side of the hotel. For me, I have difficulty ambulating, walking long distances. So even though it's accessible for like wheelchairs, it's not accessible for me because it's a longer path. And those are things that people think about disability in a binary way. And it's not just wheelchairs, you know, it's other things. And a lot of times we have hidden disabilities, and that affects Black people and Black women a lot because we can hide those things. We're already overworking ourselves. And then when we add that onto ourselves, we're going to work even harder because we're going to try to hide it. We're going to try to make sure that they don't see that and then think we're lazy as a Black person, or that we're emotional as a Black woman. So we tend to hide those things. So once we did that presentation, ACRO was inspired to start a focus group about accessibility at ACRO. And we're gonna announce, I'm actually gonna present again at annual meeting, and we're gonna announce the call for people who are interested in this. And so I encourage us as Black people to answer that call, to be involved so that we have an intersectional conversation, because we don't wanna make it accessible and it's accessible for white people because they're more comfortable coming up and saying what they need. We need to be involved in saying what we need as Black people. And you have to always know, like, there's an entryway for you. If it's through your disability, if it's through your sexual orientation, if it's through your religious practice, like, find a way to be protected in your identities, and then just bring along your other identities in that, because intersectionality matters. We're not just one identity. We're the combination of all our identities, and we should be comfortable being our full intersectional selves in higher education, although that has been difficult, but it won't change unless we fight for it. And we should fight for it where we can get entry. And for me, that's been the ADA.
Now, I mean, thank you. First of all, thank you. Thank you for telling your story. Because this is the fact when you mentioned all the things that, first of all, we can all relate, because we don't get through life with disabilities. That sat really close. Thank you. But then you started mentioning disabilities, and a lot of people think that disability has to be visual, when that's not the case. So thank you. But does every institution have an ADA department? And if not, what do you suggest?
Yes, every institution is legally required to have some type of ADA coordinator. And that's under the ADA rules and regulations. So there should be someone you can speak to get your accommodation, or just have a conversation. A lot of times they do a poor job of kind of advertising what is for you. And that's part of my research too. What can they do better? Because a lot of times it's just kind of like, oh, if you have a disability, you just go there. And even it affects our students. There are certain requirements in the ADA, and a lot of our institutions are just making the bare minimums. Like, they'll have handicapped parking spaces or disabled parking spaces. The curb cut, which is how you get a wheelchair up, will be on the complete opposite side. It's not, but all they're required to do is have the curb cut. Buildings, I'll say this, in higher education, the they didn't used to let disabled students in who were in wheelchairs who weren't ambulatory. They were rejected for that reason because of the institutions and the buildings. When the first students in wheelchairs were admitted to universities, and these were white people because obviously we weren't admitted then, they had to be carried up by other students to their classrooms. A lot of our institutions still have these buildings that are inaccessible. And students and staff members are making their plans and their days around, can they get to a building? Can they get upstairs in the building? I constantly think about, where is this meeting? How long is it going to take me to get there? And I know even not just thinking about us as staff and faculty, our students are going through this and not saying anything either about how long it takes them to get across campus, or they don't feel comfortable going up and down stairs. So it's something that we have to talk about, but there is always going to be somebody, an ADA coordinator that's there, but they're usually understaffed as well. So they can't even touch all the points that they want to.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Whitney. Let me move on. Dr. Tina DeNeen, I'll ask the same question. What does Black resistance mean to you and within your career within higher education?
Well, first, thanks to Whitney. Man, I learned a lot just from your conversation right now, and particularly as it relates to ACRO and planning ACRO meetings. So thanks for that insight. So when I learned that the topic for this webinar today was Black resistance in higher ed, I had to reflect on what that meant to me. So I had to define it for myself before I could begin to kind of formulate thoughts around my own experiences. So I started with the highest level definition of resistance, and in this context, because resistance can mean several things. And I came up with fighting oppressive structures and behaviors in a nonviolent way. So that works. That explains what resistance means in this context, but I needed to narrow it a bit more for myself. So I equated resistance in higher education to mean strategies used to help myself and others navigate the academy. And so for me, for the most part, I came up with the way I have operated over my career is through quiet defiance. Quiet defiance was how I resisted. So being a Black female, which all of you know, but being a Black female leader in higher education is often challenging, it's exhausting, and it's lonely. And what I learned along my path is that people are generally fine with hiring a Black woman to be the leader as long as she doesn't actually try to lead. That's when the problems come in. So back in the day, when I got my first role as a director, I was young, and I often found myself having to prove that I belonged in that role. And back then, I thought that the skepticism was just because of my age, since the majority of my staff members were older than me. But as I moved through the ranks, I began to notice that lots of people who looked like me were never given the benefit of the doubt. Others, not just me. And that was true not only for staff, but for students and faculty as well. And so Portia, you asked kind of like how we use resistance in order to either survive or help make changes for others in higher ed. As a university registrar, I was in a perfect position to kind of see how an institution works, how the institution with a capital I works. And while I hadn't really defined it back then, I was probably practicing quiet defiance from almost the beginning. And just a couple of examples. Because of my role, I sat on committees where we were charged with deciding whether a student who was on academic probation actually got suspended, or if they were suspended and they were appealing, we would hear those appeals. Consideration was not given equally, I was noticing when it came to Black and Brown students. So other students were given the benefit of the doubt when their situations appeared to be exactly the same. And the committee structure was the same as well. It wasn't different people coming in with different ways of viewing, because everybody has their own ways of viewing. So in a particular instance that I remember, we had two students that were appealing at two different times. Both had similar stories where they were caring for somebody in their home, and that's what made them fall behind. And they want this other chance to come back in and make it right. But but some of the committee members argued that one should be granted the exception while the other wouldn't. So the good thing about me sitting on those committees, I was able to see what those patterns were, and I was able to step in and make the argument against kind of discriminating against one while giving the other one an opportunity. So the university registrar role, you see a lot of things that some people would not see because you're not really pigeonholed. You're seeing across things that are happening across campus. So that was kind of one way that I used resistance in my career. I feel like if you have a seat at the table, you have to also use your voice. And Adrienne talks about that a lot. And I'm sure she'll talk about that later today. So that was one way of standing up for students who really couldn't stand up for themselves. And the same went for me as it relates. I was always watching out for what staff members were going through and what students and faculty were going through. The difference being that most of the time faculty they were organized. So they had a bit of protection that we don't have as staff members. You know, students have a bit of an outlet, but first generation students, for example, don't know who to even talk to. So for me, I operate through not keeping secrets. I operate through sharing information, even if people don't ask for it, because I was a first generation student. I wouldn't have known that if you got a bad grade, y'all, I did not get bad grades, I don't think that. But if you got a bad grade, I didn't know that there was an outlet. I didn't know that you could go appeal that. I didn't know that there were processes that you could go through. You just did what you were told and hoped it worked out. So I talk to people. I tell them, I give them hints that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and they don't necessarily have people at home who can give them those hints. So I guess I would say, if in the way of advice, I would just encourage people to lean on your trusted peers. Make sure you have a circle, and your circle should be people that you trust. The circle should be tight. You shouldn't tell everything to everybody. And these peers don't have to be on your own campus, because I talked about loneliness. It's a real thing, especially if you're in a leadership position. You've got to feed your soul and take care of your mental health. And because microaggressions can be very damaging to mental health. And I know if you've gone to our annual meeting in the past, I know that our president-elect, Jackie Carter, has talked about microaggressions, and they can be very damaging, and we've all experienced those. So another thing I will say, and then I will relinquish my time. I'm reclaiming my time right now. But another thing I will say is sometimes resistance can mean knowing when to walk away. And I've had that situation myself. And it was a hard thing to go through, because I'm not one to fail. I am not one to not finish something that I start. But we can talk about that if we have time for questions. Maybe I'll tell you a little more about that personal situation. But thanks, Portia.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tina. And actually, I want to say, I also appreciate what you said. So that resonated with me, quiet resistance. So I'm actually going to ask you if you would talk a little bit more about what did that look like. And I'm going to throw this out here, something that I read that specifically talked about women of color who are in leadership and how we have a stronger set of communication skills, because we have to navigate perception and how we interact with multiple people. So can you talk just a little bit more about what is your quiet resistance? What did that look like?
So what I mentioned earlier, I started when I was really young, and I was fortunate. Well, I earned the position. Let me not say fortunate, but I was kind of fortunate to become a leader at a very early age. So I'm saying that I've grown a lot since then, but in the beginning, I was very quiet anyway. You know, I got along, I worked hard, I went along with what I was being asked to do. I sat on all the committees that I was asked to sit on, even if they had nothing to do with me. And I know I was there just because of the color of my skin, but that's fine. I took those lessons and I learned from them. I got to experience lots of other people and got other opportunities because of that. But as I went on, you know, kind of progressed in my career, I think for me, I became a lot less afraid of talking back. Now, I know that not everybody's in that position, and it's not right for everybody to do that because that's not your comfort zone. But I came very comfortable in speaking up for myself and speaking up for others. I had a situation once where a member of my staff made a mistake. This was a Black lady. She made a mistake, a huge mistake, and I won't say what that mistake is, but my two bosses, who happened to be both white men, wanted to fire her right away and wanted me to fire her right away. They didn't want to fire, they wanted me to fire her right away. And so I had to push back on that, and I'm pushing back against two white men that I actually report to, and I had to say no. You know, people make mistakes. She didn't kill anybody. We can work from that. And yes, there are changes that have to be made, but we have to give people the space to make those changes and kind of prove that they are meant to be there. And she was meant to be there. So I just for me, it's just probably just talking back, like using my voice. I'm the youngest of 7. And so I always had to talk. and I don't have a problem talking. What I find, I think one of the things that I feel is hardest as a Black female leader in higher education or in any field is the ongoing disrespect that people don't even know is disrespect. Sometimes you're treated in a reductive kind of way. I don't know if it's intentional, but the result is the same. And so like Whitney said, you're always having to fight. Like you're always, you got to do your work. You got to know how you're presenting yourself because you can't come across as in a certain stereotypical way. You know, you got to go home. You got to do that side of your work. So, you know, it could be from small, and I call them microaggressions. It could be small things to really big things. But I think the disrespect to Black female leaders is probably the biggest hurdle and probably the most tiring thing that I've experienced as a leader.
Thank you. And actually, you just gave me a really nice segue to Miss Adrienne. So really the same question, and I'm just going to give you the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here to talk about Black resistance in higher education. When I think about resistance, I think about opposition. We're faced with a lot of opposition, and well, I'll get to some of that, but I got to tell you this story. My background, I came out of the Catholic school system. I'm a Chicago public school graduate of Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, which is where I met Tina DeNeen. Graduated again from Northeastern Illinois University and was doing a doctorate at higher ed at Illinois State. Didn't finish the dissertation, but it's been written. So if I can ever afford to go back, I'll go back and finish it. We were the first African-American family on our block in Chicago in the 60s. As the first family, we had our windows broken, the grass burned, the garage burned down. Well, we had to fight to walk to school. We had to fight to play in the playground. We had to fight to ride our bikes. Now, I didn't grow up in the segregated South, but I grew up on the South side of Chicago, like Michelle Obama. And my mother told us that we should not retaliate against these white folks, but we should retaliate by being educated. Now, my parents didn't have a college degree, but when I got ready to go to high school, a white Catholic high school, my mother said, "You will not run the street." So immediately, my mother affiliated me with Operation Breadbasket of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson, and the Reverend Dr. Clay Evans of the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church. All right, so right there, you see, at that point, the Black Power movement was being challenged. As you know, in the 70s, they wanted more Black faculty, more Black students in the PWIs, et cetera. And so From these experiences that I experienced young at age, shaped me into the woman that I have become and the advocacy that is deeply rooted within me. A wise man said, if you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. That was the late John Lewis. So let me just say this, that, and I firmly believe that. So I first started working in higher ed in 1979. In 1981, I went to my first ACRO conference. I, of course, was the only African-American person on staff, which proved to be true for me through most of my career, my professional career, even until my retirement from the community college in 2015. My first ACRO conference, and that's what I'm really going to focus on in this presentation, was in Denver. And it was so apropos because my presidency ended in Denver in 2014. Now, when I first started, the Black Caucus was a work in progress, even though it was an unsanctioned group at the time. Mary Kay Jones was the advocate and the leader for the Black Caucus. And we were kind of known as a cabal, which is a small group of secret plotters against a government, a person, or an authority, but that's the way we were referred to. So at this particular time, the cabal consisted of Mary Kay Jones, Cleveland James, Bill Ponder, Michael Poindexter, Ray Boros, Tanya Barnes, Tima, John Cave, who works at Tennessee State, and Fred Fresh. Now, we organized, we financed our group at each conference every year. Mary Kay Jones was our leader, and Bill Stanberry was the ACRO leader. And they met and talked about the fact that it was determined that there needed to be a person of color, most likely African-American, on the board of directors. A Black male, not a woman, was even considered at that time, but the president of ACRO. And why did it take so long? As I said, I came on board in 1981. The first Black president of ACRO was in 1992, so that's how many years? His name was Charles McKinney. He was the Dean of Admissions and Records at the University of California in Santa Barbara. At that particular time, the Nominations and Elections Committee brought forth one name for each vacant board position. There were 4 groups at that time, not 7 as there are now. And at that time, the board positions were voted for by the membership at the annual meeting only. So you didn't get a ballot in the mail like you do now, and you had to beg people to vote. You voted if you showed up at the meeting. If you did not go to the meeting, you had no vote. In 1998, ACRO received its second African-American president. He was a member of the cabal. His name was Fred Fresh. He was the university registrar at Clark Atlanta University, and he was not treated very nicely as president of ACRO at the annual meeting, I will say. There were some improprieties by the executive director at that particular time, who left his position unscathed and his reputation. However, I will say the Caucasian individuals of the ACRO group was not very happy with him and tried to scathe his reputation. So then it took 6 years from that point to get any elevation of the Black Caucus. Prior to that, the Black Caucus was just known as an affinity group. And that was a group of people affiliated with the same organization, college, or often receiving certain discounts or privileges. As an affinity group, the Black Caucus raised scholarships in conference cities. We went into the school systems and held workshops. But then in 2004, I don't know if many of you were around at that time, but Paul Taylor was the president, he was the president of ACRO. He was the vice president of enrollment and management at Bluegrass Community College. He established, along with the board, a task force of which I was selected a seat so that we would get a seat at the table. And we got a seat at the table. We got the position of Vice President of Access and Equity. And the caucuses were then established and recognized by ACRO. So don't think that the way you see it now, it was always like that. We fought. ACRO is no different. The struggle was real. As African Americans, we need to have a seat at the table or you'll be lunch. ACRO was no different. The struggles were real. Some of the people were unhappy that this had taken place. And now some of the people are still unhappy that this has taken place. Tina said earlier that you have to fight, and I always, so she talked about in silence. And I just remember the song about the gambler say, you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run. You don't count your money when you're sitting at the table because there's time for counting when the deal is done. Okay, I digress. So we established, the task force was established. I served on there. The caucuses were recognized. The Black Caucus was recognized. There were no caucuses at that particular time. From that, then you had the other caucuses, Hispanic, Asian, LGBT, etc. So Dan Garcia served as the first vice president of Group 5, which was Access and Equity, as you know it today. Some of the duties of the Group 4 VP were given to the VP for Access and Equity, of which they were not very happy anyway. But you have to continue to fight, because if you don't fight, sometimes you don't get ahead. And sometimes you just have to have a larger voice than other people, which I was not afraid to have. This is why I told you the story of my background. In 2009, I served as the second vice president of Access and Equity. In 2013, I was elected as president-elect of ACRO, and that was at the last annual meeting where the vacant board positions were voted at the annual meeting. From that portion, 214 on, you then got a ballot in your email, and then you voted online. But before then, you had to attend the annual meeting. Since that time, we've had Monique Snowden, we had Louisa Havens, Tiffany Robinson, Cassandra Moore is currently serving. Jackie Carter is president-elect now. And I'm just so pleased and so happy that we have come this far, because if I wasn't fussing and cussing a lot of people out through the years, we would not have gotten this far. It is unprecedented that there are 6 African Americans that sit on the board of directors of the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. Thank you for this time. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you so much. We actually need to document this. Like, I'm glad this is recorded, but we need to have a book. We need to have a book, because personally, coming and seeing this on being able to attend the conference virtually and seeing the Black Caucus, that was my first introduction to the Black Caucus. And I ran as if I was at a family reunion. Like, what can I do? What I need to do? But I didn't know the history. And history is important, because you have to know where you came from in order to continue to move forward. So thank you, Adrienne. And as Dr. DeNeen has mentioned, we also have Rosalind Perry, that is incoming VP for Access and Equity. So that's another count. Adrienne, through your fight and resistance, how did you balance mental health and your career and just continuing it?
Well, let me say this. I didn't just have this fight in Acro. I had this fight on any campus that I was on. I always had a big mouth. I always provided, if it needed to be opposing view, I was like John Lewis. If I saw something wrong, I said something. And I even now, to this day, friends of mine that are vice presidents, presidents of various institutions or what have you, the only thing that I could say to them each time I talk to them is do well in your career, but you must stay Black. I had a Hispanic boss once, and she was a part of ACRO, and I asked her if she attended the Hispanic caucus, and she said, no, I couldn't go to that. I said, well, see, that's because you are Hispanic when it's convenient. I have to be an African-American every day. So I have always gone up against whatever that opposition was. I kind of did not care. And sometimes you just kind of have to have that attitude. You have to be fearless instead of fearful. If in fact you are fearless, people won't like you, but they will say straight up. When I first went to that meeting that Paul Taylor had, where it was this group of people, and the first thing I said, if you didn't come here to be honest, if you didn't come here to get something done, then I would suggest you leave this meeting because we're going to be honest up in here. And as you can see from that, Miss DeNeen here I asked her to introduce somebody at a luncheon once. And she was like, oh no, I wouldn't want to do that. I said, Tina, go introduce the people. I said, because they will associate your name with your face and they will then remember you. And then from that point, she just said, if Adrienne asks you to do something, just do it. Don't ask her no question. Just do what she asks you. And I thank you for that. But it's how it was done for me. And so I figure I have to do it for other people. That's why I have been on these webinars with you guys, because it has to keep going. A lot of these people are not around anymore. And I know, Wayne, you on here. A lot of these people are not around. But when they saw us walk the halls together, they was like, here they come. We don't want to be bothered with them too much. And it probably was not easy for me to become president, because I'm sure on the N&E committee, there was some resistance, but then it was a couple of past presidents on there and a couple of Black caucus people on there that said, she's gonna be president. So there you have it. So I don't know if there are any more questions, but I just know that I am the individual that sometimes has to raise hell. And if you don't raise hell, you get no traction. And so I was that person and I raised a lot of hell. Excuse my French, but there you go.
Thank you. We do have a question. And it says, thank you for all this conversation. It's right on time for me. How do you all handle the disrespect and microaggressions in the workplace? There aren't a lot of people who look like me in my institution. I am one of 2 Black female leaders, in my workplace. I need support, but as you all have mentioned, everything feels like a fight. What are some resources or tools you've used to overcome this? So how did you handle disrespect and microaggressions in the workplace? And what are some resources and tools you've used to overcome this?
I can answer that. For me, one of the things that has empowered me is I have a lot of educational privilege, like a lot of us do here, but I went to boarding school with a lot of rich white people, essentially. And you can learn a lot there. And actually the headmaster there, the white man, he kind of pulled me aside because he noticed some things, and he was just like, don't be afraid to talk to anybody. Everybody is the same. You can come to me whenever you have something. So I was always in his office, in the assistant headmaster's office, just doing stuff. And that kind of led me to be able to talk to anybody. At my last institution, I just randomly emailed the president like, hey, you want a mentee? I figured he was a white man, I'm a Black woman. It could benefit you and it could benefit me. So you can't be afraid to talk to anybody. And then when stuff happened, I told him every time. And he said, no, people don't tell me this stuff. So when you start getting to know people who are in positions that you may be afraid to talk to, people aren't telling them this stuff. So you can't be afraid to say, this is what's happening. Also, if you want some anonymity, some schools have ombudspersons. Go start there just so you can get your voice out. And then when you build up a little more confidence, ask the people as they're disrespecting you essentially and giving microaggressions like, why did you say that? I had an instance where we were having an event and they wanted us to mix around. I have a chronic illness. I prefer to sit with people in my office who I'm already around because I didn't want to contract anything. And someone pushed back on that. And then she came around and she was like, since people want to be nasty, I said, who are you talking to? So who are you talking about? And she was like, oh no, who were you talking to? So you're gonna have to let them know that you're not gonna just accept it. She wasn't used to anybody pushing back on what she said. And from there, I went to the 88 coordinator and filed an official report on her and the dean, because the dean made a comment as well. So you can't be afraid to do it. And I was a little nervous making the report, but the 88 coordinator was like, put this in writing, because if you feel any type of retaliation, we go into the next steps. So you document everything and use all your resources.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Whitney has said. What I'll add to that is, I talked about relying on your peers and your network and your allies. Don't take that to mean that your allies are only going to be Black. Sometimes you need to talk to other people on the campus, make relationships with other people on the campus, because they're the ones who can protect you when you're not in the room. They're the ones that can say good things about you when you're not in the room. And sometimes, frankly, they're going to have a voice that's listened to when yours may not be. So pick and choose your time and pick and choose your battles. Not everybody's Adrienne, and I know that, and I've learned a ton from Adrienne, but not everybody is going to be as vocal or comfortable being as vocal as Adrienne. I was one of those people. I would rather gather the troops behind. I probably would have been the Underground Railroad kind of person, because, I'm just going to sneak them through the Underground Railroad. I'm not going to just yell at the master. So that's just how I operate. So I would always find myself dropping information at certain people. There might be a dean that I need to give certain information to. If there's a policy I saw that I thought it's a little discriminatory against certain groups, I would drop that to a dean or to an associate provost if I weren't comfortable. Now, having said that, I've become a lot more comfortable. I'm sure to some people's chagrin, I am a lot more comfortable being vocal now. But when in the beginning, and I know there are people like me, I was quieter then. So I had to find other ways of dealing kind of with microaggressions. But if you are comfortable, I think you should confront, and that sounds strong, but you should address the person about what they ask for clarification about what they said or did, why they said or did it, how it made you feel, and give them that opportunity to correct that microaggression. And then if it goes on, then you might have to take additional steps. But I just encourage you not to think that you have to be this really brave, bold person that's not afraid to talk back, because some people are afraid to make their own positions because they fear for their jobs, and not all of us can afford to walk away. So just be careful, and I tell you, rely on your network. Like Portia's talking about the Black Caucus at the annual meeting. That's kind of where I found my home, at the annual meeting. And Adrienne was right. She told me to introduce this speaker. It was an international speaker. I couldn't even pronounce the lady's name, and I'm up there trying to introduce her. And so, and from there, you know, I've had all kinds of higher level roles at ACRO, and now I believe, the first Black person on the executive team at ACRO. There's now more than one of us, but I was the first one. So, you know, just kind of working with your peers helps you in your career as well. Be yourself.
I'd like to say, within this Black Caucus group, you have a network of individuals that you can go to tell them what they might need to know. Now, I had an opportunity when I first started out. I worked for white women. They were easier to talk to than white men. When I went to the next institution, I worked for a white man where the place was just unbelievably prejudiced. I didn't really care, but okay. And we had some struggles, and he gave me a bad performance review. And I wrote a 6-page rebuttal. And after I wrote the 6-page rebuttal, they made the man retire. Sometimes you just got to go at it. And if you can write well, they really don't think you can write well or speak well. Then we got a president. I was able to go to the president directly to say things. And he, just as you said, nobody's told me this. He says, well, they told me this, that, and the other. And I said these words, they lied to you. Let me explain to you what happened. From that time, I was able to go. I had an invitation to his office at all times. If you need anything, if you need to tell me anything, and don't you be afraid. I say that, why would you think I would be afraid to tell you anything? I'm not that kind of person. But you do have this group of people allowed me to do a lot of things and to share with them, because you will only overcome this because we all are experiencing some of the same things, even though we're at different institutions.
I encourage anyone who has any other questions, please submit anything. But as we are winding down, I want to ask one last question. That sneaky thing throughout all these fights, you can have creep in imposter syndrome, meaning, are you fit to do this? Are you even supposed to be here? How did you get here? How do you all handle that throughout your fight of anything that was oppressing?
So I'll start again. So I used to think that I had imposter syndrome, like, oh, you know, getting nervous about stuff. But what I realized in my research, imposter syndrome is not a real thing for Black women. It's actually the trauma that we've received about our identities and the heavy weight that we have on us that we're seeing. It's actually a theory that was come up for white people who don't believe that they have stuff. We have other stuff. It is not the belief that we can't do anything. We know what we can do, but it's the other stuff that is on us that is actually what's stopping us. So ever since then, I'm like, that's not a real thing for me. I know what I can do, but I need to work on these other facets that are what is really holding me down, all the isms and the system and all that, to get past it. We know what we're doing. Like, the stop, you know, that you always know, you know what you're doing.
I agree, although I never thought of it that way.
Right.
Imposter syndrome is not really real because we are used to doing it and having to do it and do it all. And even if it's something that we've never done before, Black women are going to figure it out. So we've never really had that. And but I will say that anytime that I doubted myself, it was because of projections from somebody else, not from something that I thought I could or could not do. And so I think in order to combat, if you want to call it imposter syndrome, you know what you can do. You just have to make sure that you're comfortable within yourself, and you don't have to rely on proving yourself all the time. Do your job, period. Do your job. Do your job better than the person next to you would do the job so that you can get your next job. But don't allow people to project something on you because they're not comfortable either with you or with themselves.
And like John Lewis, you must say something. You just can't be the shrinking violet in the room. You got to say something. If you see something that's not right, it's not fair, it's not honest, you got to say something. You owe it to yourself as a woman, as a human being, to dispute anything that is incorrect, that you find wrong, regardless. You owe it to yourself.
And if I can add to that, Adrienne, you know, I'm always going to say, not everybody is as beautifully strong as Adrienne. So my strategy for that is, when you want to fight something or you want to push back against something, keep in your mind that you're doing that for somebody else. You're not necessarily doing it for yourself. You're fighting for students. You're fighting for the person who comes behind you. When I used to have my staff talk, you know, sometimes they would say, not really meaning it, but, you know, they're tired of these students. And I would always say, what if it's your nephew or your niece or your granddaughter? You know, make sure that you're acting as if you're working with a family member. So anytime you have to fight, if you feel uncomfortable fighting for yourself, just put in your mind that you're fighting for somebody else. And then that makes you a little bit stronger.
So, and I think this question ties into what you just said. And I'll just ask the question, how do you know when to drop an issue and when to persist?
For me, it's, you know, you get tired with an issue, like, and you know, you've like exhausted everything. That's usually when I drop it. Like, if I can feel confident in myself that I've tried everything and I'm just tired and it's bogging me down at this point, it's time to let it go. It's time to move on, and maybe you have some kind of intermediate remedy that you can do, and like, just let's do this and maybe we'll come back to that later. But as stuff starts to worry you and tie you down, as you've been trying to get it done for so long, it's probably time to let it go.
And as always, you can always bring it back. You can always bring it back. If you fall behind, just run faster. Never give up, never surrender, never rise up against all odds. Never give up, never surrender. When I was 14, the Reverend Jesse Jackson said, I am somebody. And I took that through my whole entire career. And I just stand on that. I'm sorry, I do. And you're right, Tina, everybody can't be like me, but they had to be like me, so that some other people could follow behind me and know what had to be done in order to get us there, and what they would need to do in order to get some other people there.
Absolutely. We definitely in ACRO stand on your shoulders, Adrienne. So definitely appreciate that. But to follow up kind of on what Whitney said, I agree. Once you're tired, you've done everything that you can do. If you're going home at night crying every night, you know, because you can't handle it anymore, and you know you're a person who can handle just about anything, sometimes that resistance looks like walking away. I've done it myself. I was disappointed in myself until later. I became proud of myself for doing that. But in the moment, I felt like a failure. And then I had people around me saying, why did you walk away? Why did you let that person win? You know, my sister, why didn't you sue these people? I did not, like Beyonce said, they broke my soul. I didn't have the song in time. I should have had the song to tell them not to break my soul, but my soul was broken and I had to walk away. And looking back, it was the best thing I've ever done. So sometimes resistance is walking away and caring for yourself.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you so much for taking the time out and telling us your story. Thank you, everyone, for coming and listening. We needed this. We needed this, and we need more of this. And I appreciate each and every one of you all. Thank you.
Have a great day. While you all work, I don't work.
I'm tired.
I'm retired. I don't work.